Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into one of the absolute most monumental achievements in human history, the Apollo 11 moon landing. But we aren't just here to talk about the victory lap. We are unpacking the thrilling true story of the mission's hidden disasters, the very real socioeconomic criticisms it faced back home, and, of course, the completely bizarre conspiracy theories that followed.
To kick things off, I want to ask you a quick question. Did a literal ballpoint pen save the lives of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin? Picture this. It's July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong has just successfully navigated the lunar module, known as the Eagle, down to the moon's surface. He's struggling to open the hatch against the pressure, and as he squeezes his giant, bulky spacesuit through the narrow exit, he accidentally snaps a piece of the module off. And because there's absolutely no air on the moon to carry sound, he doesn't even hear it break. Okay, let's dive into this. The piece Armstrong unknowingly snapped off wasn't just some cosmetic dial. It was the ascent engine arming switch. Without this critical component completing its electrical circuit, the lunar module literally could not reignite its engine. Simply put, they had no way home. They were stranded. But to understand how they ended up in this precarious, seemingly doomed situation, we've got to first look at why they were rushing so fast to get there in the first place. Section 1. The Cold War Space Race. You see, the real catalyst for Apollo 11 wasn't just pure scientific curiosity. It was a fierce, high-stakes competition to beat the Soviets. The US had been totally shocked when the Soviets launched Sputnik in 1957, and then beat them again by putting Yuri Gagarin into space in 1961. To fulfill President Kennedy's unbelievable promise to reach the moon before the decade was out, NASA had to move at absolute breakneck speed. Looking at the timeline, you can really see this terrifying urgency. In early 1967, the Apollo 1 mission ended in a tragic cabin fire that claimed the lives of 3 astronauts. Yet, the geopolitical pressure was so immense that NASA just couldn't stop. From late 1968 to mid-1969, they were launching a new mission every 2 to 3 months. They bounced back from total disaster to launch Apollo 11 in just over 2 years. Section 2. Alarms and Low Fuel. Imagine riding a massive 3 million kilogram Saturn V rocket into orbit. The spacecraft splits. Michael Collins stays behind in the command module, Columbia, while Armstrong and Aldrin begin their perilous descent to the moon's surface in the Eagle. Just as they're about to land, the tension absolutely spikes. At 8:10 p.m., alarms start blaring inside the tiny cabin, 1201 and 1202. Neither astronaut knows what these codes mean. They radio Earth. Well, it turns out the guidance computer's processing system is completely overloaded. Thankfully, the computer was brilliantly designed to prioritize critical landing functions, but all these distractions forced Armstrong to take manual control at just 150 meters above the surface. Looking out the window, Armstrong suddenly realizes the automatic system was flying them directly into a field of massive boulders. He has to manually steer them away to a new landing spot 4 miles out, but all that maneuvering takes fuel. At 8:16 p.m., Aldrin checks the gauge. Only 5% fuel remains. Mission Control starts a terrifying countdown to decide if they have to abort the whole thing. With a heart-stopping 30 seconds of fuel left before a catastrophic crash, Armstrong finally radios back, "The Eagle has landed." So, they survived the landing, stepped onto the moon, and made history. Amazing, right? But remember that broken switch from earlier? When they returned to the module 2.5 hours later and realized they were stranded, they had to improvise. Buzz Aldrin looked around the tiny cabin, grabbed his simple ballpoint pen, and jammed it directly into the broken mechanism. And you know what? It actually worked. The pen completed the electrical circuit, allowed them to arm the ascent engine, and completely saved their lives. Section 3. Nixon's secret backup speech. Now, getting off the moon was only half the battle. The return journey was just as fraught with danger. After reattaching to the command module for the journey home, the crew faced yet another crisis. Before re-entering Earth's atmosphere, they had to discard the service module, but the thrusters failed. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins could only sit there and watch as debris floated violently around them, threatening a fatal mid-space collision. The stakes of this entire endeavor were so life or death that the United States government had prepared for the absolute worst. President Richard Nixon actually had a secret alternate speech written just in case the astronauts were killed. The excerpt is chilling. It reads, "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace." Fortunately, by a sheer miracle of engineering, they landed safely and were immediately thrown into a mandatory 2-week quarantine just in case they brought back any deadly lunar pathogens. Section 4. debunking lunar conspiracy theories. Despite all these very real dangers, the stress, the near misses, and the quarantine, decades later, a really strange phenomenon emerged. A lot of people began to claim that the Apollo 11 mission was a farce, a Hollywood hoax filmed on a soundstage to fool the Soviet Union, which is pretty ironic considering the Soviets officially acknowledged the American moon landing as factual. But let's look at the evidence these skeptics point to. Basic engineering easily explains away the most famous myth, the flapping flag. Skeptics say, hey, there's no air on the moon, so how is it waving in the breeze? Well, NASA knew a standard flag would droop instantly in a vacuum, so they cleverly designed it with a horizontal rod across the top. But the rod got stuck during deployment, causing a ripple defect. The only time the flag actually flutters is when the astronauts are physically twisting the aluminum pole into the ground, which acts like a giant spring. Then there's the classic question, where are the stars? Why are there no stars in the background of any lunar photos? The answer here is just basic photography. The moon landing took place during lunar daytime. The sun was shining super brightly, and the brilliant white spacesuits and the lunar module were highly reflective. Because of this, the cameras were set for really short exposure times to capture these bright objects. Think of it like taking a photo with your smartphone outside at night with a really bright flash turned on. The faint stars in the background simply get totally washed out. Skeptics also love to point to the shadows, claiming that because they point in multiple non-parallel directions, NASA must have used multiple studio spotlights. In reality, the sun was not the only source of light. The highly reflective lunar dust covering the entire surface of the moon actually acted as a massive secondary light source, bouncing illumination in all sorts of directions and creating complex, varied shadows. Finally, we have the famous photo of Buzz Aldrin, where Neil Armstrong is clearly reflected in his visor. The myth asks, if Armstrong isn't holding a camera up to his eye, who on earth took the picture? The fact is, the astronauts couldn't easily hold cameras up to their faces wearing those huge, bulky helmets. The specialized cameras were mounted directly right onto the chests of their spacesuits. Plus, there were multiple cameras mounted to the outside of the lunar module itself to capture Armstrong's first steps. Section 5. The True Cost and Legacy. Now, while those hoaxes are pretty easy to dismantle, there actually were grounded, valid criticisms back then. The Apollo program was stunningly expensive. The cost at the time was $24 billion, which adjusts to roughly $100 billion today. During an era fraught with the Vietnam War, domestic poverty, and major civil rights struggles, there was massive public backlash. Protesters and newspapers rightfully asked why these vast sums of money were being literally fired into space instead of being used to build universities or solve income inequality right at home. These were valid, heavy socioeconomic questions that NASA and politicians had to navigate, which ultimately led to budget cuts and the early end of the Apollo missions entirely. But there's a hidden side to all that massive spending. And this brilliantly illustrates the long-term impact of the space race. To actually get to the moon, NASA had to invent entirely new computing systems. In the early 1960s, microchips were a brand new, incredibly expensive, and rarely used technology. But NASA placed such a massive demand for integrated circuits from companies like IBM that production had to scale up dramatically. Because of the space race, the price of microchips plummeted by more than 90% in just 5 years. And what you should really take away from this is how it directly impacts your life today. By trusting these brand new silicon microchips with the lives of astronauts navigating the hostile vacuum of space, NASA basically proved to the entire world that this technology was robust and reliable. That massive, highly criticized investment indirectly sparked the modern tech revolution. The computing confidence we gained from Apollo paved the way for the personal computers, the internet, and the smartphones that you and I rely on every single minute of our day. Section 6. Looking forward. The Artemis era. It's kind of wild to think about, but no human being has walked on the moon since Apollo 17 in December of 1972. But after over half a century, NASA is now actively preparing to return with the Artemis program. The goals show a marked evolution from the 1960s. NASA aims to return humans to the lunar surface as early as 2025 or 2026. This time around, the mission is incredibly focused on diversity and sustainability. They plan to send the first woman and the first person of color to the moon. And rather than just planting a flag and immediately returning home, they aim to establish real, long-term, sustainable exploration capabilities. Which leaves us with one massive, incredibly exciting final thought. The desperate, dangerous, and incredibly expensive Apollo program inadvertently gave us the microchip and essentially launched the digital age. So after 50 years of waiting, as we prepare to finally step foot on lunar soil once again, what new hidden leaps will our return to the moon unlock for humanity's future? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope you found it as fascinating to learn about as I did to share.